Before he ever set foot inside the FBI, he didn't hold back his fury. He accused the Bureau of Protecting Jeffrey Epstein of shielding one of the most notorious predators in history. He said the names were there, the list was real, and that keeping it hidden was an act of evil. The clip is still out there, his words still echoing. They're sitting on it. Put on your big boy pants and let us know who the pedophiles are. That line wasn't just a comment, it was a promise, a challenge, and a dare aimed at the FBI and at Congress. He said the infamous Black Book was under the direct control of the FBI director, that the decision to release it could be made in an instant. To many, those words sounded like a clear path to truth. But more than 200 days into his tenure as director, the reality of power collided with the promises of the past.
Member for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Director Patel. You and I have not had the opportunity to meet, and alas, you failed to respond to the 8 oversight letters I've sent you over the last 7 months. So we do have a lot of questions piling up for you, but I want to start with a word of praise. The first FBI director was J. Edgar Hoover, who steadfastly refused to hire women, African Americans, and other minorities as agents. And although he was a closeted homosexual who lived in domestic partnership for decades with Clyde Tolson, he also participated in anti-gay crusades. He aggressively promoted what we would today call white Christian nationalism, and he would undoubtedly be turning over in his grave to see as one of his successors a first-generation Indian American and a proud Hindu. So I congratulate you on being a breakthrough in this sense and being a beneficiary of the civil rights movement that opened up the FBI and the federal workforce to lots of people who never would have been hired in its first decades. Alas, you share J. Edgar Hoover's dangerous obsession with blind loyalty over professionalism and effective public policy. For Hoover, it was blind loyalty to him in keeping his secrets. For you, it's blind loyalty to Donald Trump in keeping his secrets. During your confirmation, it was widely noted on all sides that your primary qualification was your unwavering loyalty to Trump. Unlike other directors, you had no work experience at the FBI, but you had made over 1,000 media and political appearances in support of Trump's campaign. Your Senate confirmation vote was 51-49, the closest in history, with your opponents warning you were not qualified and had no interest in actually developing the qualifications for the job. I hoped that they were wrong. Alas, they were not. While most other new FBI directors drew on their experience as FBI agents, you didn't have that. But you did write a picture book trilogy for children ages 5 and up based on your experience clashing with President Trump's political enemies. In your book, you describe your literary alter ego, Cash the Knight, as a wacky, easily bored wizard carrying out King Donald's vengeance by driving his enemies out of the kingdom. In the books, King Donald is besieged by the evil Hillary Queentown, but saved in the end by Cash. Then Cash goes on to catch mules who are stealing the 2020 election for the great King Donald from Sleepy Joe. And then in the third book, Cash takes down the dragon of the jalapenos, nicknamed the DOJ. Your supporters had hoped that you would graduate from imagining yourself a romantic fairy tale knight to actually running America's premier federal law enforcement agency. Alas, just as we've learned how dangerous it is to put a science-denying anti-vaxxer in charge of our public health, we've learned how dangerous it is to name as director of the FBI a man who thinks of himself as a fairy tale knight who keeps a fire-breathing dragon named DOJ at home to forcibly drive villains out of the kingdom. When Charlie Kirk was assassinated, while his killer was still on the loose, you decided you didn't need to be at FBI headquarters in Washington to work with your team while the chaotic manhunt unfolded. You spent your evening dining in a swanky Midtown Manhattan restaurant and tweeting out false information that the subject of the shooting was in custody, a statement you had to retract 1 hour later. Your performance was so disturbing that even the MAGA base was alarmed. Culture warrior Christopher Rufo, who just a few months ago sat in your chair as a Republican witness, observed that you performed terribly, and he called for your ouster. The FBI might be able to survive your delusions of grandeur and the explosively volatile temper that was on display yesterday in the Senate. But the intractable problem is that you are running the FBI not as a law enforcement agency charged with keeping the American people safe, but as a political enforcement agency working directly for the president's vengeance campaign. 7 months in, it's impossible to overstate the destruction, chaos, and demoralization you've brought to the FBI and its workforce and the resulting danger your actions have caused to our country. You've been systematically purging the FBI of its most experienced and qualified agents, division leaders, and experts in counterterror, counterintelligence, and cybersecurity, precisely the people who have the expertise you lack and which the FBI and the country need. They've been expelled from the ranks of the Bureau simply because they did their duty investigating crimes, including those committed by the mob that attacked the Capitol on January 6, 2021, and beat the hell out of more than 140 police officers, or simply because you suspected them of being insufficiently loyal to Donald Trump. You illegally sacked Brian Driscoll, the former acting director of the Bureau and a decorated counterterrorism expert who worked at the FBI for nearly 20 years. According to Driscoll, you told him your own job, quote, depended on the removal of agents who worked on the cases against the president, regardless of whether the agents chose to work on those cases or not. You added, quote, the FBI tried to put the president in jail and he hasn't forgotten it. You forced out the leader of the Salt Lake City field office, Mehtab Saeed, just weeks before Charlie Kirk's assassination, depriving the FBI of an experienced counterterrorism expert described by her colleagues as absolutely the best and legendary. She would have led the FBI's manhunt had she not been fired. When Trump decided that rounding up immigrants with no criminal records was more important than preventing crimes like human trafficking of women and girls, drug dealing, terrorism, and fraud, you ordered the 25 largest field offices to divert thousands of agents away from chasing down violent criminals, sex traffickers, fraudsters, and scammers to carry out this immigration crackdown. Director Patel, you treated the men and women at FBI with disrespect and paranoia. You've assembled a roving band of freelancing henchmen within your office and charged them with conducting unauthorized investigations, targeting and harassing career FBI employees. Amazingly, you forced senior leadership to repeatedly take polygraph tests to prove their political loyalty and pushed out leaders who refused these demeaning exercises. And now we're seeing one very clear reason why you want to build a political FBI. The Epstein files. You want an FBI blindly loyal to Trump and to you as his enforcer so you can continue your cover-up of a massive international sex trafficking ring with more than 1,000 victims, betraying all of the survivors of the sexual violence. Before you got in this job, you called for full release of the Epstein files, telling podcaster Benny Johnson that the only reason the list was not released by DOJ and FBI was, quote, because of who's on that list. Upon your confirmation, you promised that, quote, there will be no cover-ups, no missing documents, no stone left unturned. And anyone from the prior or current Bureau who undermines this will be swiftly pursued. This spring, you ordered hundreds of agents to pore over all the Epstein files, but not to look for more clues about the money network or the network of human traffickers. You pulled these agents from their regular counterterrorism or drug trafficking duties to work around the clock, some of them sleeping at their desks, to conduct a frantic search to make sure Donald Trump's name and image were flagged and redacted.
When he sat before Congress, the questions came back like a storm. Why haven't you released the names? Where is the list you said was under your control? Why are the files coming out in fragments, in dribs and drabs instead of being laid on the table in full? Representative Jamie Raskin made sure those questions weren't softened. He threw the past statements back at the director, word for word, demanding an explanation. The room quieted because everyone knew this wasn't just a matter of process. It was about whether the man who once demanded transparency was now using the system as a shield. The director's answer was not fiery, not defiant. It was careful. Everything lawfully releasable has already been released, he said. Multiple federal court orders restrict what can be shared. Every step has been done within the bounds of the law. The moral firebrand who once denounced cover-ups now spoke the language of legal limits. And that's when the tension broke into plain view. Raskin wasn't going to let it slide. He interrupted, pressed, demanded specifics. Which courts? What orders? Why can journalists get pieces of a Rolodex while the Bureau still holds a trove of seized devices, documents, financial records? If the Bureau has Epstein's computers, his emails, his file cabinets, where is that material? Is it still locked away? The director repeated that everything he had authority to release had been released, that anything else was under the lock and key of the courts. But the explanation rang hollow to a public that had heard the earlier promises. This wasn't just a dispute about files, it was a clash between two registers, moral certainty and legal reality. On the moral side, the demand is simple: victims and the public deserve to know the truth. The names of those connected to Epstein's crimes should not be hidden. On the legal side, the explanation is equally simple. Courts issue orders. Evidence tied to investigations, grand juries, or sealed agreements cannot just be made public on a director's whim. One register is rooted in the language of justice and closure, the other is rooted in the machinery of law. When they collide, the result is frustration, distrust, and outrage. The exchange revealed something deeper, the long shadow of decisions made decades ago. Patel stressed that much of what the FBI has comes from search warrants executed between 2006 and 2008. That era of investigation was already hemmed in by narrow warrants and non-prosecution agreements. In other words, the scope was deliberately limited from the start. If evidence wasn't seized then, it may not exist in the FBI's hands today. That doesn't absolve responsibility, but it does explain the bind. You can't release what was never lawfully obtained. Still, Raskin's fury was rooted in something more fundamental: accountability. If you once demanded that the Bureau lay everything bare, shouldn't you, as director, fight harder to make that happen? Shouldn't you petition courts, challenge restrictions, and prove to the public that every legal avenue has been exhausted? The courtroom battle may be slow, but the willingness to fight is what builds credibility. Raskin's point was sharp: promises before power ring hollow if they aren't matched by action once in power. This is why the clip from the past is so damning. Back then, the words were absolute. The black book is under the director's control. Release it. No excuses. Now the same person, sitting in the director's chair, adds qualifiers. Everything lawfully releasable, bound by court orders, restricted by historical agreements. To the public, that feels like a betrayal, even if the legal argument is technically true. The debate over the Black Book itself shows how messy this really is. Years ago, journalists got hold of Epstein's Rolodex, a simple contact list with names and numbers. That was never proof of crimes, just names scribbled in a book. But the FBI is believed to have more documents, digital files, devices, financial records. If that exists, it could reveal who helped Epstein, who covered for him, and who may have joined in his exploitation. The frustration is that the public has never seen the full picture. Instead, there are leaks, partial releases, court filings, and redacted documents. Every piece adds fuel to speculation without offering closure. For the victims, this is devastating. They don't want fragments or debates about legal process. They want acknowledgement, truth, and a clear record. They don't want to hear that non-prosecution agreements from nearly 2 decades ago still hold power over their pain. They want names. They want to see who enabled Epstein, who stood by him, who turned a blind eye. When the director points to court orders, the victims hear excuses. When Raskin pushes for disclosure, they hear someone finally voicing their demand. The clash is not academic, it is human. It also raises the question of institutional trust. How can the public trust an agency that seems to release information only when forced, and only in fragments? The director says more has been released under his watch than ever before. He points out that previous administrations had the same chance and did nothing. He even cites numbers: thousands of predators arrested, a 35% increase in enforcement. That may be true, but it doesn't erase the perception problem. The people don't measure credibility in percentages. They measure it in honesty, consistency, and courage. The heart of the problem is the gap between rhetoric and reality. Before taking power, it's easy to make sweeping promises. Once in office, you inherit constraints, legal baggage, and sealed files. What was once a simple moral demand, release everything, becomes a complicated legal dance with courts and statutes. Leaders often find themselves trapped between what they said and what they can do. But that gap doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. It becomes a test of character. Do you fight harder, even if the odds are long, or do you retreat into the safety of legal technicalities? That is why Raskin's line of questioning stung so sharply. He wasn't just asking for files. He was asking for proof that the director's earlier moral certainty hadn't vanished in the face of legal obstacles. Did you litigate aggressively? Did you push the courts? Did you take every step possible to unseal the truth? If not, then your earlier words were just theater, and that in the court of public opinion is a devastating charge. The broader implications stretch beyond Epstein. This is about how institutions handle accountability when the stakes are highest. The public has seen decades of secrecy, from intelligence files to sealed investigations. Every time a promise of transparency meets a wall of legal jargon, faith erodes. People start to believe the system exists to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable. And when that belief takes root, it spreads. It doesn't just damage one agency, it damages the very idea that justice can be trusted. The exchange also underscored how language shapes perception. Patel used the phrase, everything lawfully releasable. It's precise, but it sounds evasive. To lawyers it's clear, to ordinary people, it feels like a hedge. Raskin, meanwhile, framed his questions in moral terms: promises, truth, names, exposure. One register speaks to statutes, the other to conscience. Both matter, but when placed side by side, the legal language feels cold, while the moral language resonates. That's why the hearing struck such a nerve. Imagine being a victim watching that exchange. On one side, a man once promising to rip open the files, now reciting court restrictions. On the other, a lawmaker demanding the exposure of every hidden name. Which side would you feel heard by? Which side would you trust? That's the painful reality. Even if the director is correct in his legal defense, perception is reality in the eyes of the public. And right now the perception is that the Bureau protects itself more than it protects victims. The frustration also lies in the piecemeal nature of releases. Bits of information dribble out, some from journalists, some from court filings, some from official releases. Each piece fuels speculation. If one document leaks, what else is still hidden? If one court order blocks release, why not fight it harder? The lack of completeness is what creates suspicion. It's why people believe there must be more, that there's a deliberate effort to shield names. Whether true or not, the effect is the same: distrust grows. So, what should the public take away from this? First, the clash was never about one list, it was about the tension between moral obligation and legal restriction. Both sides made valid points, but they operate on different planes. Raskin appealed to justice and truth. Patel cited law and process. Neither cancels the other, but the friction between them is what creates outrage. Second, accountability doesn't end with citing court orders. If transparency is blocked, then leaders must show their fight. They must reveal the litigation, the petitions, the arguments they've made to unseal files. Only then can the public judge whether every step has truly been taken. Without that, promises look like empty words. Third, transparency is not an event, it is a process. Demanding names is a moral imperative. Demanding the steps to legally unseal them is the practical path. Both are necessary. Without the moral fire, there is no urgency. Without the legal fight, there is no progress. Finally, there is the question of trust. Leaders earn trust not by perfection, but by consistency. If you once said the Black Book was under your direct control, you cannot later hide behind legalese without showing what you've done to overcome it. The public doesn't expect miracles, but it does expect honesty. If the files can't be released, show why, show the orders, show the fight. That's what transparency means in practice. As the hearing closed, the tension hung in the air. The director insisted he had released everything he could. Raskin insisted that wasn't enough, and the victims, once again, were left waiting. Waiting for closure, waiting for truth, waiting for someone in power to keep their word. This is the story at the heart of the Epstein files debate. It's not just about a black book or court orders, or a clash between a director and a congressman. It's about whether our institutions can ever truly deliver the transparency they promise. It's about whether leaders can match their moral certainty with real action once they hold power. And it's about whether victims will ever get the full acknowledgement they deserve. The truth may still be buried in sealed files and locked cabinets, but one thing is already clear: the fight over Epstein's records is no longer just about evidence. It's about credibility. It's about who the public believes is truly fighting for them, and that fight is far from over. So ask yourself this: has the director done everything possible to unseal the truth, or has the promise of exposure been swallowed by the machinery of law? Share this breakdown, talk about it, and press your representatives to demand the litigation records. Because in the end, transparency only becomes real when the public refuses to settle for half measures.